Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. And today you will notice I'm wearing my Viking hat. Why? Because today we're talking smoked mead. Now, there isn't much in here because most of it went in the bottles. The bottles, of course, will be aged for a few months. But the fact is, I smoked this honey, and when it came out, it was missing a lot of those green notes, that kind of bread-like unfreshness that happens right after you're done fermenting. That you typically age a mead in order to make it taste a little bit more mellow and delicious. This came out perfect. I mean, it's quite drinkable right now. Now this, of course, what I have in my flagon here is a little cloudy. It's got a little yeast in it still. It hasn't completely cleared out because it was at the bottom. But I'll show you all that and how I smoked it and how I fermented it. And you can do the same thing. It's pretty easy to do. Most of the time you're doing nothing because it's just sitting there in the dark, in a cool, dark area, fermenting. So let's get started. Smoking! I'll start out by splitting our 6 pounds of honey into these 2 stainless steel pans. 3 pounds will go into each gallon glass jug or carboy, and this will give a lot of surface area for the smoke to penetrate by having it split between these 2 pans. Once the honey is smoked, I'll mix it all back together so we have a homogeneous mix of honey to start our fermentation process. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got our honey for our honey mead. Let's get it in the smoker. The honey will stay in the smoker on the highest shelf for 2 hours. Once the honey was done smoking, it was time to get it into some mason jars to allow a couple of days for the smoke to fully interpenetrate the honey. Let me tell you, this was a very messy process, so I'll skip over much of that. But needless to say, I was a sticky mess by the end of it. And incidentally, the honey was very smoky to the taste, and I wasn't at all sure if the mead would taste any good when it finished, but I tell you what, I was pleasantly surprised when I tasted the final product. Well, we're here ready to make our mead. We've got our 6 pounds of smoked raw honey, and that will be going into these 2 jugs, 3 pounds into each one. Now, I'm going to do one of these jugs just plain mead. And this other jug, I'm going to put in about a half to 3/4 of a quart of frozen black cherries that have been pitted. And that technically means this will be a mellow mel. It's cherry mead, in my opinion. And this will be mead. But before we do anything, the first thing we need to do is get all of our equipment sterilized. And to do that, I'm going to be using calcium hypochlorite. This is basically, this here is a laboratory grade version of it. It's basically pool shock. And with that, you can make a very good sanitization liquid, which will put everything that we're going to be using, our jugs, our airlock, our, cork here, anything we're stirring with, anything like that needs to be sanitized. The other thing is, speaking of our airlock, now people will put a variety of things in their airlock. Typically they'll start out with just water. They might put vodka or grain alcohol in here. They might put their sanitization liquid in here. And that's all well and good. The point of this is to let CO2 out and not allow any bacteria or wild yeast in. The problem is, if you get negative pressure in here and it sucks some of that in, now you got a problem. If you've got sanitization liquid in here and that goes into your mead, you're done. You throw this away at that point because you're going to kill all the yeast and that's it. And now, of course, you got sanitization liquid in there. You don't want to drink that. If alcohol goes in, that's okay. The only problem is you have to continuously fill these because alcohol evaporates. About every 3 to 5 days, you'd have to remember to fill this. And if you forget, this will become empty. And then bacteria and stuff could get in. Water, of course, water is the playground of bacteria, so if you get, as long as the water doesn't get sucked in, you're fine, but if it does, you're right back to square one. So I'm going to use something completely different. I'm going to use food grade glycerin. Bacteria cannot grow in glycerin. Glycerin's pretty thick, but it'll still work for our purposes. And if it gets sucked into here, guess what? This will improve the mouthfeel. In fact, many wines add glycerin. And of course, that's what mead is. It's honey wine. I'm not going to actually add it on purpose, but if it gets sucked in, I know it'll be fine, and bacteria can't grow in it. So the other thing I want to talk about is our additives here. Now, of course, the star of the whole production is our yeast. I'm using Mangrove's Jack's mead yeast, specifically formulated for making mead. And there's enough here for these 2 gallons. Actually, there's enough here for 5 gallons, but I'm doing 2 gallons today, and I'm just going to use it up. I'm also going to be adding a packet of black tea to each one. Not for flavor. This is to add tannins. You can also use grape tannins, but that again helps with mouthfeel, with the taste, by giving it a little bit more dimension. It's the same thing. We put hops in beer, for example, or bitters in various drinks. Juniper berries for gin, things like that. But when we get started, I'm going to be putting 1/2 of one of these tablets. These are called Campden tablets. I don't know if you can see that there's tablets in there. Unfortunately, some of them are broken up, but we're going to be putting 1/2 a tablet into each one. What this does is kill wild yeast while preserving, you know, these hardy yeasts. So it won't hurt this, but it will kill any wild yeast that's in here. We're also going to be adding some yeast nutrient. Now you might be wondering, why does yeast need nutrients when it's got all this wonderful sugar to eat? Well, it does need some other micronutrients to do its job well. And the thing is with honey is antibacterial, antimicrobial, it's even hard for yeast sometimes to break it down. This will help keep the yeast strong. And that's why meads take a little longer sometimes. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. As I did mention, I am going to be putting some frozen cherries in one of these and making a melomel, and the other one is just going to be plain old mead. Except it's going to be Smoky Dave's Smoky Mead. So let me get these sanitized and we'll get started. I'm adding 2 teaspoons of calcium hypochlorate to 2 gallons of water and washing all of my equipment. Now I'm going to put 1 gallon of filtered water in the pot. I'm just going to use one of the carboys to measure it out. And then add all the honey into the pot, warm it up until it's fully dissolved, because this will make it so much easier to get the honey water mix into the carboys. I'm going to go ahead and get the honey and water mix up to around 110 degrees. Now this is perfect for getting the yeast started. And I'm going to add the yeast nutrient, and of course all of the honey and this gallon of water directly to the mix, and just watch that temperature. Make sure it doesn't get above 110. We just want to get that honey completely dissolved into the water, and then we can pour half of it into each of our carboy jugs and then fill them all the rest of the way up with just filtered water. A lot easier process than trying to pour the thick honey directly into those jugs. Now, from this point on, we are just going to split up our honey, water, yeast, and yeast nutrient mix between our 2 carboys. As you can see, I've already added the tea bags, and in the one carboy, the black sweet cherries to make our Viking's blood. Now, once the honey mix has been added to each carboy, I will fill them near to the top, leaving a couple of inches of headspace to allow fermentation bubbles. I'll also add my 1/2 Campden tablet to each carboy as well, and then once filled and completed, we'll place our airlocks into each of the carboys using our food grade glycerin, and then now comes the waiting game. This is the next day. I've put both of these down in my basement where it's a little cooler and where the lights are off most of the time. And you can see we have active fermentation going on. although the plain honey mead seems to be a bit more active. See a lot more bubbles going up through that than I am through the one with the cherries. Second day and things are really taking off. You can see the bubbles in the airlock. And if we get up real close here. As you can see, it's bubbling quite vigorously now. And now on day 2, the cherry one is really taken off. And I believe the additional sugars in the cherries themselves may have something to do with it.
First, racking.
It's been 4 weeks since we started the fermentation process, and now it's time to perform our first racking of the mead. This just means moving the liquid carefully from one container to another without disturbing all of the sediments at the bottom of the carboy. Those sediments are dead yeast and other bits, and in the case of the cherry mead, all of the cherries will be left behind as well. Now, racking is done using a siphon, and again, I will be leaving links to all of the equipment and materials I used to make this mead in the description down below. A siphon requires that the receiving vessel is below the one we'll be moving the liquid out of, so here's how I set that up. And of course, then I have to remove the airlock, place the top siphon in, and this siphon is designed with a pump capability, and it also has a special end on it that allows it to sit above the sediment. And if you carefully push it all the way down to the bottom, you can get all the clear liquid without pulling in too much of the sediment. You're going to pull in a little bit, especially on the first racking. So I'm trying not to get too much in, but once you get the siphon action going, as you see I have here, the bottle begins to fill. So the racking is done, and I'm going to allow these carboys to continue to ferment until they are complete. I unfortunately did not get any good footage of my hydrometer measurements, but at this point, both of these ferments were sitting at around 11% ABV. They still have a little ways to go. However, the Viking's Blood or Cherry Melomel is going to have some additional dried tart cherries added, about a half a pound, to really make that cherry flavor pop. Here, the mead is gotten, and you can see there on the bottom all the dead yeast. And of course, this is after adding the potassium sorbate. Kills the yeast that's remaining. I also put in some Camden, half a Camden tablet in each one, along with a half a teaspoon of this potassium sorbate that will stop all the yeast. I'm using the same method I used before when I racked the mead. However, this time there is a bottle filler end piece on the end of the siphon. Once this filler is not touching the bottom of the bottle, it stops allowing fluid to flow, thereby eliminating the mess of trying to stop the siphon when the bottle is full. And there it is, 3 bottles of Viking's Blood Cherry Melomel and 3 bottles of golden smoky honey mead. If you want to make your own mead, consider the following book. I'll leave links down in the description below. And this is the book I use for all my mead making. Follow along with my video and you can make a delicious smoky mead that will wow your friends and family. And if you haven't, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you know when I drop new videos. And until next time, just remember, it's no joke. Everything's better with smoke.